Today I'm going to show you guys some things that you need to know if you want to make some old school boom bap beats. When you're making an old school boom bap type of beat, there are a few things that you want to keep in mind to get your beat to actually sound old school. And I'm going to go through each of these one by one. First off, let's talk about the BPM of your beat. Typically with this type of beat, you should set your BPM to somewhere between 80 to 100. If I have a sample or a melody built that's pretty dense, I will tend to go towards a lower BPM somewhere around 80 to make sure that the final beat doesn't end up sounding too cluttered. Or if I want to make something that's a little bit laid back and a little bit lower energy, I'll also go for a lower BPM as well. But if my melody or my sample is relatively thin, I'll choose to go for a higher BPM. Or if I want to make something more high energy or a little bit more aggressive, I will bump up the BPM in this case as well. By the way guys, if you enjoy my videos, please do subscribe. If you get bored or tired of my videos, it's just one click away to unsubscribe, but it really does help my videos out, so I would appreciate it. Next up, we're going to talk about sample selection. These old school boom bap types of beats really did rely on the use of samples, so to get that authentic feel to your boom bap beat, I really would recommend using samples as well. To find a good sample, there are a number of ways you can go about doing this. Heading to YouTube and just merely typing in jazz samples will get you some good results right off the bat. Or if you're looking for a specific type of instrument, you can type that into YouTube instead. Some common types of instruments that would show up in these boom bap types of beats would be things like Fender Rhodes, vibraphones, pianos, as well as guitars. So again, just typing in vibraphone samples. We have a bunch of samples here that use a vibraphone, so this would be a good idea to use for our boom bap types of beats. In my experience, I would say that the better samples are the ones that come from the 1970s. I just find that the more we get into the 80s, the more digital and synthetic the instrumentation becomes. And that doesn't necessarily translate to the best sounding samples to get this type of aesthetic, but that's just my personal taste. One thing that I did used to do whenever I found a good sample that I liked, I would head over to this site here, discogs.com, and I would search up a specific song that I liked. And let's say I liked the way a certain instrument sounded in this song, I would look up who played that actual instrument. So let's say here, for example, I liked the way the electronic piano sounded. I would look up who played it, which is George Duke in this example, and I would look up his catalog to see what other songs he's played on or if he has albums of his own. And this is a great way to find good samples, so that's a little tip for you guys if you're looking for samples yourselves. And once you find the sample that you want to use, you can throw it inside of a sampler and go ahead and chop it to create your own loop, or just loop it as it is. I've done a few videos on sampling techniques, so if you want to learn how to sample better, hit the link right above my head after this video is done. One thing I do want to point out, you don't necessarily have to use your sample to drive or create the melodic component in your beat overall. With this beat in particular, you guys can hear if I solo it. It's not melodically complex by any means. In fact, it's a pretty simple progression here. But I can use some other components or instruments to introduce some musicality into my beat. For example, I can use my bass line here. Speaking of which, choosing the right bass tone is going to be really important to achieve that boom bap aesthetic. Choosing the wrong bass tone can really mess up your beat. This is something that I hear a lot when people try to make these types of beats. The most common type of bass to match this aesthetic would be an upright bass. This is a very common instrument in jazz, and since boom bap beats sample jazz, this is going to fit right into the aesthetic we're trying to pursue here. Another really common type of bass from this era are subby synth types of basses like a Moog bass. And for those of you that have Omnisphere, if you just go down to the synth bass section and type in Moog, you're going to find a bunch of basses down here. But even if you don't have Omnisphere, if you find a bass patch that sounds similar to this, and then just take the low pass filter and just bring it down a tiny bit, so this type of bass can work as well, although it's going to create a little bit of a different aesthetic to your beat. Another way you can choose a good bass to match this old school aesthetic is to just simply sample one. And if this is something that you're interested in learning about, I did a video outlining some of the more important things that you need to know if you want to sample basses, so check that out right above my head if you're interested. I walk you through step by step on how to sample basses in that video. Moving on, another important concept when it comes to making a boom bap type of beat is the drums that you choose. And the best way to go about your drums, in my opinion, if you're trying to make a boom bap beat, is to just simply find a drum break and chop it up. The same way we found our samples, we can do the exact same thing by just going to YouTube and typing in drum breaks. And to chop them up, personally, I use Fruity Slicer. Chopping up drums doesn't typically require intricate or elaborate chopping, so that's why I use such a simple tool like Fruity Slicer. And if you do this, you can keep your drums as they are and just loop it, but personally, I think chopping them up and creating your own drum pattern might be a better way to go, just because you have a little bit more control over what you're doing with your actual drum pattern, which is really important. And more importantly, you can also control how many drum sounds you use in your beat. A lot of the beats from this era really restricted the amount of drum sounds that they used in their beat. So if you want to pursue this exact same aesthetic, doing the same thing on your end might be a good idea. Looking at the technology that was used back in the day, a lot of the machines that were used as samplers really had limited sampling space. If you were making beats using this technology, more than likely you only had a certain amount of sounds that you were able to use in your beats. So even though you might feel the need to throw in multiple hi-hats, multiple types of snares into your beat, it might not be the best thing if you're trying to pursue this older type of aesthetic. Limiting the amount of drum sounds that you use, and honestly the amount of sounds that you use in your beat overall, will really help you achieve this aesthetic a lot better. You guys can see with the hi-hat that I chose here, it's the same hi-hat over and over again instead of using the multiple different hi-hats that show up in this break. Same thing with the kick here, I'm using this one same kick over and over, and the same snare shows up again and again. And a lot of the times when you use a drum break, you might run into the issue where the drums just sound a little bit too weak as they are. They might not fill up enough room in the beat, so layering your drums is always a good idea. But you don't want super clean, super dense drums that really shine and cut through in your mix, just because that doesn't really match the aesthetic of these beats. So to achieve this type of aesthetic, it might be a good idea to take the drums that you've layered underneath, like this kick that I have here, and really reducing the volume or taking an EQ and really cutting out a lot of the more powerful frequencies in this sound. That way it's still going to have that weak, almost muddy feel to it, and it's not going to necessarily cut through the mix as cleanly as it would if you're making a more modern type of beat. But again, that's sort of the point. That's the thing that we're trying to pursue here with these old school types of beats. We almost want a suboptimal sounding mix. And while we're here, really playing around with the pitch of your drums can really help it fit with the sample a little bit better. For example, here with my hi-hat, I pitched it way down somewhere around 600 cents. This is how it would have sounded at its original pitch. And again, you can do this by ear to your own personal taste. I sort of like a more grimy, a little bit more of a dark hi-hat with this type of aesthetic. So yeah, you can just take your drum, pitch it up and down, see what sounds best to you, and go from there. But this is also really important and something worth pointing out, not only for your drums. Again, let's think about the technology that was used back in the day in order to sample. If you found a sample that you liked off of a vinyl, the producers back then would often speed it up or slow it down using their turntable. And this is completely different than how we do it today. Back then, you just had one slider to make this adjustment, and the pitch that you might have selected or landed on at the end might not have been pitch perfect. Back then, they couldn't easily jump up and down in complete semitones like we can today, so let's think about how that's going to translate into our modern beat making process here. If, for example, you wanted to play some piano on top of your old school type of beat, in order to better fit the aesthetic of a boom bap beat, it might be a good idea to play with the fine tuning here. Again, if a lot of the samples back then were slightly off pitch, it might be a good idea to match this type of aesthetic by taking our pitch perfect sounds that we pull from our plugins and make them a little bit off pitch. So that might be something that you might want to try. And finally, there are a few smaller techniques that I want to go through with you guys in order to get this boom bap type of feel to your beats. One is adding a layer of noise into your beat. You guys can see here, I just have some tape noise. So something like this or some vinyl noise is also a good idea. One thing that I actually like to do from time to time is sidechain my noise to my sample or my loop. By no means do you have to do this, but personally I find if I have a very consistent noise going throughout my beat at the exact same level, it can sort of wear my ear down. It makes the beat sound a little bit less dynamic, so the exact same way you would sidechain an 808 to a kick, I do the exact same thing with my noise to my sample. So every single time the sample goes up in volume, the tape noise is going to go down. You guys can hear the tape sound isn't playing at a consistent level. But again, by no means is this something that you need to do, it's just a small little detail that I personally like to play around with. Another tip to help pursue this aesthetic, like I mentioned earlier on in this video, these types of beats didn't necessarily have the most optimal mixes. So something that I commonly do is just go into a bunch of my sounds here and just go ahead and reduce a lot of the frequencies like I showed you guys. And that's especially true in the high end. I try to make sure that pretty much none of my sounds have a prominent presence in the high end range, just because a lot of those clear, clean, bright sounds don't really show up in these old school types of beats. And speaking of your mix, another thing that you might want to do is get your sounds to be a lot more mono in your stereo field. Again, I really feel like that sort of cluttered muddiness is really synonymous with this genre, so that might be a good idea if you find your beats sound a little bit too clean. Some other things that you might want to do is use emulation effects on your beats. So things like RC20 or isotope vinyl, or something that I really like to use is reels. They can really help degrade your sounds as well as make them sound a lot more warm, which is exactly what we want if we want to make an old school type of beat. I did a video that shows off a plugin that sort of mimics what RC20 does, and it's absolutely free. In terms of different types of production techniques to get your beats to sound a little bit more like a boom bap beat, I find a lot of these beats had these horn samples at the beginning of their loop, so that's something that you can introduce into your beat as well. So just finding a horn sample like this, and then simply just taking an EQ and really constricting the frequency that it takes up, as well as throwing on some delay and maybe some reverb if you want, can really help achieve this type of aesthetic. And those are some really important things that you need to know if you want to make boom bap beats. If you guys have found this video helpful, like and subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below whether you have some techniques that you want to share of your own. My free drum kit is available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord if you want your beats reviewed live. I do that every 2 weeks, and I will see you guys next time.